Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Connie Kim. In the face of economic difficulties, North Korea has reportedly issued domestic bonds for the first time in 17 years. Its trade with countries around the world has dropped while it continues to funnel money into its nuclear weapons program. Today, we discuss North Korea's struggling economy and advancements in its nuclear weapons capabilities. Joining us today is Ambassador Christopher Hill. Ambassador Hill is currently the Chief Global Advisor and Professor of the Practice in Diplomacy at the University of Denver. Ambassador Hill served as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs and the U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Korea. Scott Snyder also joins us today. He's a Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of the Program on U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of 50 years of South Korean foreign policy and offers predictions. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from Colorado, Ambassador Hill, and from Tennessee today, Mr. Snyder.
Thanks, Connie.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to start off with North Korea's issuance of domestic bonds. So Ambassador Hill, an OECD official, admitted that North Korea has been issuing these bonds. This is the first time since 2003. What do you think is the significance of this?
Well, North Korean fiscal and monetary policy is almost as opaque as its nuclear program. So it's often hard to figure out, but I think the bottom line here is Kim Jong-un has made a lot of promises on the economy, and clearly they're not coming to pass. And I think he's looking to soak up some of the cash that's in the economy in the form of these bond sales, essentially issuing paper in order to increase government coffers. Whether it'll work in the context of an essentially unreformed economy is another matter. And I think we'll see a lot of effort by the North Koreans really to look for some sanctions relief as another way to improve their fiscal accounts. They are in some trouble right now.
So, Mr. Snyder, does this show, is this another sign that North Korea's economy is struggling hard?
I think it's the main sign, perhaps, or the most serious sign that we've seen, that the North Korean leadership is having to resort to coercion in order to soak up hard currency within its own borders. This is really a type of, in the North Korean context, a type of expropriation of existing wealth. Of course, if you have money in North Korea, it's because you have connections to the regime. But in a way, this is a call by the leadership to draw on the money that has been made. And if you are the recipient of a request to buy bonds, most undoubtedly you're feeling like you've been extorted.
Mm-hmm. And there has been criticism that the issuance of domestic bonds is a way to force a foreign currency from the donjus, the entrepreneur class of the merchants. So do you think there will be growing frustration from these donjus towards the government?
Well, I would say there will be frustration, but it's kind of a catch-22 because the donju make their money through prior relationships and approvals with the government. And so as a result, it's very hard, I think, for them to refuse this kind of request because the wealth that they've gained is actually dependent on the existing regime.
Mm-hmm. So North Korea's economy has been struggling, especially after the sanctions regime kicked in. The number of countries North Korea has been trading with has dropped to about 50% last year compared to the early 2000s. And its dependence on trade with China has jumped, not to mention this trade volume has also dropped 90% in the face of the pandemic. So what does this tell you about North Korea's trade and economic structure?
Well, it's very China dependent, Connie, and despite North Korean efforts to try to diversify its economy and to get around the dependence on China, it would appear that no real progress has been made. And really the greatest concern, I think, is the drop in imports that we see most recently as a result of North Korea's quarantine. I think that it remains to be seen whether that might have other domestic impacts on prices of goods in North Korea, or whether, in fact, now that the virus concerns are easing, it'll be possible to restore some of that supply chain that North Korea relies on from China in order to for its exchanges internally to survive.
So, Ambassador Hill, Mr. Snyder just pointed out there is going to be a decrease in imports. How do you think this is going to impact the North Korean economy in the long term?
Well, again, Kim Jong-un has made a big point that he is going to address economic issues. This is kind of unprecedented in North Korea because usually it's military first, but here we have the economy up there as well. And I think he's going to find it very difficult. First of all, I don't think he really understands these issues. Secondly, as much as we like to talk about changes in the North Korean economy, the fact that there have been roadside stands of vegetables and things like that, these are pretty de minimis reforms. And I think anyone who spent time, as I did, in Eastern Europe and saw the efforts in the 1970s, 1980s to reform, and then realized how little those efforts really amounted to, I think North Korea is really going to have to decide at some point what it's going to do about this economy. And so far, I don't see a big effort. There is an idea, and you hear about this from time to time, that somehow they can open up parts of the economy to the Chinese, in effect, rather ironically, create kind of concessions to the Chinese. Something like that may happen, but I think overall they're looking at a long decline in the economy, with the question being, at what point does this affect the capacity of the political authorities to rule the place?
Ambassador Hill, I want to talk about the revealed unclassified documents from the State Department in 2010 after Siegfried Hecker visited the uranium enrichment facility in Yongbyon. He had reported this to the State Department. You were the U.S. chief nuclear envoy leading the six-party talks until 2008. When you heard of this, what went through your mind?
First of all, rather ironic, I must tell you. We always knew that they had made purchases of equipment consistent with a uranium enrichment program. So we felt first order of business, shut down the plutonium. Second order of business, keep the door open to uranium enrichment. And ultimately, at the end of 2008, the North Korean failure to give us adequate verification, their failure to allow us essentially to look beyond the Yongbyon complex, was ultimately why we could not continue and why the Obama administration was not able to get things going.
So, Ambassador Hill, what you're saying is that plutonium posed an immediate proliferation risk, so you had dealt with that first. But do you think it would have been different if plutonium and uranium were dealt at the same time? Because there is criticism that the six-party talks should have dealt with uranium as well.
Well, first of all, I would say if you looked at percentage of time that I spent talking to the North Koreans, it was over the uranium enrichment program, because we knew a lot about the plutonium program. And in fact, the North Koreans were quite honest about it because they knew we had overhead views of it, and we had a pretty clear idea of how much plutonium they had produced, which interestingly was verified when we looked at the records of the Yongbyon reactor. So that was not so much a negotiating problem. The negotiating problem was over UEP, the uranium enrichment program. So a lot of my time was spent saying, what happened to these the purchases of this equipment?
So you did say that a lot of your time negotiating with the North Koreans were spent on talking about the UEP program. And the difficult thing about uranium enrichment facilities is that it's hard to spot because it can be operated secretly underground. President Trump has also talked about five of these after the Hanoi summit. And there is consensus within Washington that there are other uranium enrichment facilities outside of Yongbyon. So how can we address these going forward later in the long term?
It's very difficult. Certainly, I mean, there are ways to sort of look at a facility, look at the draw on the electricity in the area, and you can kind of figure out why is there such a demand on electricity in this area. It's otherwise farming or something. So there are various technical things, but it's much more difficult than looking at a plutonium at a nuclear reactor from outer space, which you can clearly see, when it's on, when it's off. And we had people there actually to check on these things and actually to disable the thing. Our plan was to keep it disabled. That is, make it difficult for the North Koreans to reconstitute it. And the metric we had was 5 years. The theory that if the negotiations went bad, they wouldn't be able to gin up the plutonium facilities for at least 5 years because of the repair work. That pretty much turned out, although right now they are clearly, they have the capacity now to have plutonium. Every country that has engaged in nuclear programs has engaged with them with not only plutonium but also uranium enrichment. We suspected that, and that is why we always kept the door open to uranium enrichment.
So, Mr. Snyder, there are a lot of skepticisms that North Korea will not declare its nuclear facilities. How can we address this?
So I think that the broader lesson historically, I think that I'm reflecting on, listening to Chris in the 2005 period and thinking about 2018, is that we have consistently had a kind of debate over whether it should be all or nothing, or half a loaf is better than none. That was reflected in the plutonium/uranium debate in the mid-2000s, and I think that it also was an aspect of criticism of President Trump's approach in the Hanoi summit. But I think it's pretty clear that regardless of the negotiation approach, we have simply failed to be able to change North Korea's aspirations. And that is really the key thing that has to change if we expect North Korea to move off of a security-first approach relying on nuclear weapons as the basis for its security and power for the regime.
As a matter of fact, the U.S. intelligence community is suggesting that North Korea may be able to give up part of their nuclear weapons program in exchange for sanctions of relief. So do you think this is the practical approach?
Well, nothing's happening because the North Koreans aren't engaging. And I think the reason why they're not engaging is because they have no interest in what is on offer, a denuclearization for normalization approach. What they want is détente, not denuclearization.
And before we go, I want to talk about the U.S.-North Korea talks prospects. So the Russian ambassador to North Korea said that the bilateral talks seem to have been postponed until after the U.S. presidential election. Do you share this view?
I think that's the reality of the situation. I don't think the North Koreans are going to push hard for any kind of negotiations. I'm not sure they're really interested. I must say that Hanoi offer, where North Korea offered to decommission the entire Yongbyon facility, obviously that's only a subset of what they've got going. But I think it would have been worth more than a few hours of discussions. I think we should have really looked at it. I think what the Trump administration has succeeded in doing is having these sort of broader sanctions, which were stronger than anything that happened before. And so I think they're quite right not to give those up. But certainly I would have listened to what North Korea was offering, and maybe there could have been some kind of bargain, but not in the period of time that the U.S. allocated. So I don't see anything happening before November at this point.
Do you share this view as well, Mr. Snyder?
Well, and so what that means is that the North Korean strategy is likely focused on re-engagement in 2021. And so what we should be looking at is what are the tactics that North Korea is likely to try to use in order to shape the environment for a re-engagement, either with a second Trump administration or with new leadership in Washington.
So there is indeed speculation in Washington that North Korea is going to try to maintain the status quo and make moves after the U.S. presidential election is over. So we'll have to see what kind of events may lead up to the November elections. Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Hill and Mr. Snyder, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That does it for today's Washington Talk. Thank you for watching. Please join us again next week for more analysis. Goodbye.